In the high desert of southern Peru, there's a stretch of barren, rocky ground about the size of a small city, covered in drawings so enormous that for over 1,000 years, almost no human being ever saw their true shape. A hummingbird stretched across nearly 300 feet of desert floor, a spider longer than a basketball court, dead straight lines that run for miles without deviating more than a few feet. They're called the Nazca lines, and they were carved by people who, as far as we know, never left the ground. No hot air balloons, no aircraft, no hills tall enough to see the full designs. And yet the proportions are so precise that modern researchers using satellite imagery still marvel at the accuracy. This is Archive of the Ancients, and today we're walking the desert that some once called the largest astronomy book in the world. Let's start with the basics, what these lines actually are, and how old they really are. The Nazca lines are geoglyphs, large designs made by removing the top layer of reddish iron oxide-coated stones from the desert surface to expose the lighter-colored ground underneath. Because the region gets almost no rain, wind, and erosion, these exposed lines have remained visible for roughly 2,000 years. Archaeologists date them to between 500 BC and 500 AD, created across two main phases: the earlier Paracas phase, from around 400 to 200 BC, and the main Nazca phase, from roughly 200 BC to 500 AD. The site covers roughly 450 square kilometers of desert plain along the Rio Grande de Nazca Basin, about 400 kilometers south of Lima, and was officially inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1994. There are hundreds of individual figures, animals like monkeys, birds, a killer whale, and a figure some call the astronaut because of its rounded head, alongside geometric shapes, spirals, and long, perfectly straight lines that in some cases stretch for several miles. So how did people with no aircraft manage to build figures with this kind of scale and precision? This is actually one part of the mystery that modern experimental archaeology has mostly solved. Researchers have found wooden stakes still driven into the ground at the ends of some lines, and the leading explanation is that Nazca workers used a grid method, sketching a design at a small manageable scale, then using stakes and long cords to proportionately scale that design up across the desert floor, essentially like a giant compass and ruler system. Experiments recreating this method, including a famous test led by researcher Joe Nickel, have successfully reproduced Nazca-style figures using nothing but stakes, cord, and teams of workers walking measured paths. So the how is largely settled. The real mystery, the one that's kept archaeologists arguing for 80 years, is the why. The first major theory came from American historian Paul Kosok and German mathematician Maria Reich, who began studying the lines in 1941. Kosok noticed that one line aligned almost perfectly with the winter solstice sunset and famously called the desert the largest astronomy book in the world. Reich spent nearly 50 years of her life living near the site, measuring lines by hand with a ladder, tape measure, and compass, eventually publishing her theory that the lines formed a vast solar and lunar calendar, and that specific animal figures represented constellations, including the idea that the giant spider figure symbolized Orion, and the monkey represented the Big Dipper.
Reich's work is largely why the world knows about the Nazca lines at all, and her decades defending the site from vehicles and looters helped get it UNESCO protection. But here's the important, honest part. When other researchers tested her astronomical theory more rigorously, it didn't hold up as well as hoped. In 1968, astronomer Gerald Hawkins ran a computer analysis on 186 lines and found that only about 20% aligned with any significant celestial event. a rate statistically indistinguishable from what you'd expect by random chance, given how many stars are visible in the night sky. Anthony Avini's later work reached a similar conclusion in 1990. The astronomy in the lines appears local and partial, not systematic. So the giant celestial calendar theory, while historically important, is no longer the leading explanation among most archaeologists today. That doesn't mean Reiche's work was worthless. It drew serious scientific attention to the site and led to its preservation. But the strong claim that the entire Pampa functions as an astronomical instrument did not survive statistical testing. So what do most researchers believe now? The theory that's gained the most traction involves water and ritual. Researchers including David Johnson and Donald Prouse have argued that many of the geoglyphs, especially the trapezoid shapes, align with underground aquifers and fault lines capable of carrying groundwater. Under this view, the lines may have marked or ceremonially connected to water sources in one of the driest places on Earth. Closely related is the ritual walking theory. Anthropologist Johann Reinhard and others have proposed that the straight lines and large trapezoids weren't meant to be looked at from above at all. They were meant to be walked as part of processions and rituals asking for water and fertility from the gods. Excavations near the ceremonial center of Kawachi, connected to the Pampa by long lines, support the idea that this was a pilgrimage landscape where communities gathered periodically for ritual activity rather than permanent settlement. There's also research suggesting a social and territorial function. A study analyzing sight lines between different geoglyphs found that roughly 2/3 of them were positioned within view of other geoglyphs, suggesting that whatever activity happened at one site, construction, ceremony, or otherwise, may have been intended to be witnessed by people at another. Under this view, the lines helped bind together dispersed communities across the Pampa through shared, visible ritual activity, reinforcing group identity in a harsh desert environment. And yes, because we have to address it, there's the theory, popularized by Eric von Däniken in his book Chariots of the Gods, claiming the lines were built with the guidance of extraterrestrials, or as landing strips for alien spacecraft. Maria Reich herself publicly rejected this claim as absurd, and mainstream archaeology has thoroughly debunked it. The ground-based stake and cord method has been successfully replicated by researchers, meaning no aerial guidance, let alone alien assistance, was ever necessary. What makes the Nazca lines a genuine, ongoing mystery isn't the construction method anymore. That puzzle is largely solved. It's the intention. Why dedicate this much collective labor across generations to designs that could only be fully appreciated from an altitude the Nazca themselves likely never reached? Every leading theory, water ritual, pilgrimage pathways, social cohesion, explains part of the evidence, but no single explanation accounts for every geoglyph, every alignment, every trapezoid. The Nazca people themselves left no written records explaining their intentions, so everything we know comes from painstaking measurement, statistical testing, and educated inference, a reminder of how much can be studied about a civilization without ever hearing its own voice. So here's the question we'll leave you with. Were these lines a prayer for rain, a map for pilgrims, a way to bind scattered communities together, or something we still haven't fully figured out? We've laid out the leading evidence-based theories. Now we want your take. Drop your theory in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey across one of archaeology's strangest deserts, subscribe to Archive of the Ancients. We uncover a new forgotten mystery every week.